Good morning and welcome to the final day of the Australian Gender Economics Workshop. My name is Leonora Rees and I'm here representing RMIT University and the Women in Economics Network, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here also in my role as chair of this workshop's organising committee. It's been a team effort, so thank you to all of the members of the organising committee for making this happen. Gathered on this land in Melbourne, we would like to acknowledge the people of the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations, on whose unceded lands we are conducting the activities and business of the university. We respect and acknowledge their ancestors and elders past and present. Now, already as part of this workshop, we have heard a dynamic array of research and policy insights on gender differentials in society and explored how to better understand and tackle them using economic tools. And in addition to the research paper program, in our gender lensing masterclass, this illustrated the need to cast a gender-sensitive lens on economic policy making broadly, because gender inequality requires more than just that small package of women-targeted policies. Our academic career session equipped our junior female economists with some invaluable wisdom and advice from our senior mentors, including encouraging women to make your voices heard in the profession, not just for yourself, but as an advocate for those without a voice too. And this is where Professor Shelley Lundberg reminded us that economics is going to be better with you in it. Our keynote presentation by Professor Shelley Lundberg presented us with the hard evidence on the biases and institutional barriers that exist within our own profession of economics. It was dismal, wasn't it? But it was a breakthrough in terms of the depth of evidence that is now accumulating and that is going to be too hard to ignore. And then in our dinner address last night with Professor Lisa Farrell, Lisa equipped us with a package of hands-on strategies that university departments can adopt using a neat framework that she called SHE, S-H-E. Be seen, be heard, and create a system that is equitable. Now, as acknowledged yesterday by Professor Tim Fry, this event has been made possible with the generous support of our sponsors. And now, to build even further on the rich body of insights and expertise and innovative directions for change, it is a true honour for us to be welcoming Professor Iris Bohnet, made possible through our partnership with VicHealth and with the generous financial support of the Ian Potter Foundation. So Professor Bohnet is here in Melbourne as one of the leading thinkers with VicHealth's Behavioural Insights and Gender Equality Initiative. And shortly, I'm delighted that we'll be handing over to Gerald Richter, a CEO of VicHealth, to share with us a little bit more about this exciting initiative that VicHealth is embarking on as part of its Leading Thinkers program. Now, there's so much I could say about Professor Bohnet, and Gerald is going to say a lot of that, but I'm also going to pull out one key thing. You are one of the co-directors of the Women and Public Policy program in the Harvard Business Kennedy School, and like many of us here, you are a behavioural economist. That means that, like you, Professor Bohnet is passionate about correcting gender inequities that we observe throughout all windows of life. And she is curious about how everyday behaviour can unintentionally perpetuate these inequities. And it's through the hidden power of stereotypes, biases, and basically the cognitive flaws of being a human. And as much as economists advocate for objectivity, and we try to convince ourselves we are really objective, Professor Bohnet is about to demonstrate to you that we all carry this bundle of unconscious biases, even economists. Now, it's one thing to recognise all these biases and barriers, and it's another thing to identify, well, what do we do about it, and how can we use economic tools to fix it? Gosh, if only someone could just pull together all that wealth of knowledge on how unconscious biases infiltrate our everyday organisations and practices and decision makings in workplaces, and synthesise all those findings through an economic lens and an evidence-based criteria, and produce a really convenient manual on what actions we can take. Well, fortunately, that's what Respondent has done. In the form of her book, What Works? Gender Equality by Design. Now, first of all, we, the Women in Economics Network, we love the book because its beautiful turquoise colour perfectly matches our colour scheme too. And we have to admit to you that we have been using your book as a thank you present for many of our guest speakers at WEN events, which also means we had to come up with another idea for your present. That's fine. Secondly, we love the book because it advocates for the goals and the values that WEN is all about and that RMIT is all about, and indeed that probably most of you and your organisations are all about. And that is making the most of our available pool of talent and skills and insights that are embodied by our people so that we can arrive at better outcomes, better decision making, and better performance. Third of all, we love the book because it's a really empowering fusion between the research and the knowledge base and hands-on applications for the real world. And as economists, as researchers, as policy practitioners, that is that magical nexus that we are striving for. What we arrive at with this book is a synthesis of the economic, the psychological and the sociological research crystallised into this action-oriented suite of strategies that businesses and governments and individuals can put into practice to tackle gender inequalities. And it's not just random thoughts, it's backed by the evidence. Now, the common thread that is emerging from this research is that addressing gender inequalities is not about fixing the women. It's like women have they're broken in some way. We have some sort of flaw or deficiency. The evidence is building that this is a dead-end route to go down, and instead we should be focusing on fixing and reshaping the cultural and institutional architecture that we operate in. And as Professor Bohnet's work reflects, reprogramming human beings is pretty difficult, if not impossible. But our workplace practices are a function of something that we have created ourselves. Hence, we can redesign them and create psychological nudges to change people's behaviour, so they're less contaminated by biases. Now, to me, this notion of fixing the institutional architecture rather than the individual resonates in some ways with this evolutionary journey of being a female in a male-dominated field. And I'd like to bring your attention to another book. It's not competition for your book, it's actually very complementary. It's called Womankind by Kirsten Ferguson and Catherine Fox, two Australian authors. And in this book, the authors put forward this theory that as individuals, maybe this is something that many of you have experienced, we go through, well, they come up with 4 stages of what they call gender awareness. The first stage is that you're oblivious to the effect of gender. And increasingly, we grow up in environments where women from a young age are told, you can do anything, you can achieve your goals. Gender is not a factor, which is great to believe in. And as many of us here would advocate, you wouldn't want to use gender as an excuse for your underachievement. You want to believe that meritocracy prevails, and you believe that equal effort will yield equal reward. So in that first stage, we're not tuning into gender discrimination, and if we do encounter it, we deny and ignore it. The second stage, you start to notice there are actually some gaps between men and women's outcomes in society, and even though we're brought up to believe in meritocracy, you don't necessarily think it's a systemic problem. Instead, we're told it's the women's problems themselves. It's our choice to have children, choice of which industry path to go down. It's due to our lower level of ambition, apparently. So being a female is a liability, but it's not something you can do anything about. Now, the third stage is what the authors call awakening. You start to notice barriers to gender representation that can't be rationally justified by women's choices. For example, women's contributions to meetings are ignored, or conferences feature an all-male panel, even though there are female experts available. Job appointments emerge out of old boys' connections rather than actual credentials. Women aren't rewarded or even penalised for demonstrating the same behaviour or attitudes that would be applauded amongst men. So it's in this third stage you start to go, something's not right here. And then the fourth stage is the more positive stage where we move towards advocacy. And there's a recognition and an acceptance that systemic gender biases exist. And there's a quest to understand why it exists and how to fix it. Because all of you know you have value, skill, talent, ideas, personal life experience to offer, and that workplaces and organisations and societies are better when everyone can contribute. So my last comment here is that I think that 4 stages of gender awareness within the individual can be mirrored in what we have observed in society. It's almost like societal institutions and governments have gone through the same process. To begin with, they like to believe that gender doesn't matter. So we have these equal opportunity laws and anti-discrimination. So gender isn't meant to make a difference because we've got these mechanisms in place that should eradicate the effect of gender. And then within this societal framework, there can be a denial that there is a systemic problem, but instead blaming women for their choices and deficiencies and telling them, you know what, you need to step up, lean in, be more assertive, move into construction and engineering jobs instead. That's how we'll fix the problem. And then I think this is where a lot of companies are at now, in that awakening stage, where they're still wondering, something's still not working. We've given out all these policies, but something's not working. Women are still being underrepresented, overlooked, held to a higher standard of account. They're being penalised for acting just like a male. Something's not right. I know. Let's do diversity training for 2 hours. Put everyone in a room, teach them about diversity and come back, and it should fix their internal biases. And then you have the companies and governments and organisations that have moved on to that 4th stage of advocacy and taking action and realising that the diversity training didn't work. And businesses realise that the system has been set up to favour those in charge, that sociological norms need to change. And this is where Professor Bohnet's book comes into play. It's that handbook for organisations that are at that 4th stage themselves, where they realise we can't keep trying to change the women, we actually need a set of strategies that we can put into place ourselves. Now, disrupting cultural conventions entails disrupting the power balance, and hence this resistance and backlash and scepticism that we may encounter. And I've heard Gerald talk on this topic of change management before in a very insightful way, and she's reassured us that if you are encountering resistance, it's actually a good sign because it means you're onto something and you are making meaningful change. So it's my pleasure to invite Gerald Rector, CEO of VicHealth, to come up and share with us more information about VicHealth's Leading Thinkers Initiative, which is a groundbreaking innovation for Australian government bodies. And I have to also flag that earlier this week, VicHealth hosted an incredible behavioural insights and gender equality forum with Professor Bohnet, and not just Professor Bohnet, but also former Prime Minister Julia Gillard, which presented a compilation of what works case studies. And Wen was very proud to be featured in these case studies. We referred to our student video, which is available online, which showcased role models talking about their careers. And we also talked about our Pathways in Economics Careers Day, where you can see the school students there talking to real economists and breaking down stereotypes about what an economist looks like and what an economist does. We were really grateful to be involved in that process. And Gerald will formally introduce Professor Bohnet to present what I guarantee you is going to be a fascinating and compelling encapsulation of the power of unconscious bias and, most importantly, what we can do about it. Thank you.
Thanks. Oh, thanks. Can you hear me? Thanks so much. Oh, there we go. It just takes a little glitch in the system. Thanks so much, Leonora. And it's really fantastic for us to be here, and I really do thank the WEN Network and RMIT for having us here today. I too wish to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Pay my respects to elders past, present, emerging, and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be here today. I would also like to acknowledge it's so fantastic to have Professor Callum Drummond here, the Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Research Innovation and Vice President of RMIT. Just fantastic to have you in the House. And also Tim Fryer, the Head of School of Economics, Finance and Marketing. Where did he go? Oh, up the back there. Just one of the students just hanging out, which is fantastic. So thank you so much for hosting us here today. And I hope that you've had a good couple of days. It seems like it. And I know that you're going to find a lot of interest and a lot of intellectual rigour in what Iris is presenting today. And I guess that for us in Victoria that have been working in the area of gender equality and preventing violence against women, I think that in Australia, Victoria is kind of anecdotally known as the gender equality state. And I guess it speaks volumes to the work that's been happening across Victoria for a very, very long period of time, and the prioritisation that many, many people and many organisations have taken towards this topic. So our focus on gender equality is from a 15-year history in the work, and it really did start in 2003 when we did the world first burden of disease study, which showed for the very first time that violence against women was a leading contributor to death, disability and disease for women aged 15 to 44 years. And that was the moment, I think, certainly for us at VicHealth, but also for policymakers and more broadly across numerous sectors where we understood the relationship, the health and well-being relationship to the issues around violence and gender equality. And for us to be able to quantify that in a burden of disease study was a really seminal moment in the discussion across Australia. This is our second Leading Thinker residency, and it's a contemporary extension of that historic work that we've been doing. And I guess, as all of you know, behavioural insights is a field that allows us to tap into the aspirations and motivations about how people behave. And it's not how we want people to behave. And I think in health promotion, we have this way of that we just think rationally everybody's going to, when you get up in the morning, you're going to have your fruit salad, then at lunchtime you'll have your nice bowl of salad, and then at night time you'll have a small protein and maybe some steamed vegetables. There won't be any donuts and there won't be any chocolate cake, and there won't be a glass of wine at the end of the day as well. So there's this real kind of sense that people make decisions, thousands and thousands of times a day, and they're not always rational. And that's why we're so interested in this field of behavioural insights and behavioural economics. It's also how you can support the individuals, but also be working in the system to make that environment the place where those decisions can become an easier choice for individuals. And I guess for us, which is powerful when you're thinking about trying to design for gender equality. And our first foray, as I mentioned, this is our second Leading Thinker, our first foray into this area was in 2013 with Dr. David Halpin of the Behavioural Insights team, which was then sitting in Prime Minister and Cabinet in the UK. And over the past 5 years, certainly we've seen an enabling environment happen across Victoria where policymakers in government, but also private sector companies, lots of private sector companies now have developed their own behavioural insights capabilities. And for us, we've also worked with many of our partners, and particularly partners at the grassroots and community levels across Victoria, to understand how behavioural insights can help them achieve better programmatic outcomes. So how do we get here today, pairing behavioural insights with gender equality? It all seems so simple now, I think, that we're 2 and a bit years into the residency, but I guess our work, as I said before, over the past 2 decades has built that compelling evidence of the link between health and well-being and gender equality. And, we want to create an environment in which women and girls are treated with respect and empowered to reach their full potential. So we decided that the second Leading Thinker residency, we really wanted to ramp up the focus on gender equality, and we wanted to use it as a way to shift the tools and the aspirations, the expectations, and also behaviour of women and men and boys and girls. Going back to what Leonora said, it's not about fixing women on any level. So Iris actually shares this residency with Dr. Jenny Klugman, and Jenny's been out a couple of times over the last 2 years progressing the work with us in the same time that we've been connecting with Iris while she's been back in at Harvard. And Jenny's the Managing Director of and works out of the Georgetown Institute, Georgetown University as well. So to have two of global experts has been absolutely fantastic for us, and I think we feel incredibly privileged, particularly to have Iris here this week. We certainly recognise that even the best intentioned organisations can find cultural change hard, and that task of translating strategy into action really challenging. And the executive team got to sit with Iris yesterday afternoon where we started to talk about that. Even where, we've got the most fabulous enabling environment at VicHealth, but it is a really hard piece of work to do. And I think that what we've been really looking at is, everybody understands the intentions, but what we really need to be moving into is the action piece. Our leading thinkers have been working on 2 significant gender equality research projects, and their findings are really casting that valuable light on how to move the needle on gender equality, media and workplaces generally. And I'll just briefly touch on 2 of those before I formally hand over to Iris. So the first one is a world-first piece of research and big data analysis of print media reporting of women in sport. It's involved analysis of 42,000 print articles over a 4-year period. It's world first in terms of its reach, but also in terms of its depth and scale as well. So not only have we quantified the underrepresentation of female athletes and sports teams, we've also got this much more granular, nuanced information about how the portrayal of female athletes differs from that of men, and tied to this, the factors that influence gender stereotypes. So we haven't released it yet. It's going to be coming out, again, we were talking about this yesterday, we're coming out in the next few months, we'll say. And the news, just a little sneak peek, the news is looking positive. This isn't the positive bit, that women and girls continue to be underrepresented in media, and we all, particularly in sports media, and we know that piece. But when the coverage does occur, the media is more positive in its portrayal of women's sporting achievements than we had anticipated and speculated when we first undertook this research. So to capitalise on this, VicHealth is going to be developing up some tools and guidelines to support media outlets and journalists to generate more gender equitable content. And a second trial involved removing gendered language from job advertisements and de-biasing that language that occurs in the hiring process. And the trial was pursued by around 20 organisations, and it was part of the Department and Premier and Cabinet's Recruit Smarter trial. So I guess for us, we've been building upon this work, not just from the last 15 years of work of VicHealth, as I mentioned, but the work of so many people over the last 20, 30, 40 years. And for us, again, just that theme of we understand good intentions, but we actually want to be moving into action now. And we want to be moving faster because I don't have 200 years to wait, and I'm pretty sure all of you in the room don't either. Leonora's done such a fantastic job introducing Iris. I think that, just as a personal note from my perspective, Iris has been incredibly generous this week. An incredibly insightful person who's been able to just, gently ask the questions that need to be asked of certainly myself and the executive team and many people at VicHealth, and has really been able to frame, I guess, the world that we really desire and vision and would like to live in a way that is tangible and achievable. So you are very lucky to have her here this morning. I know you're going to find her fabulous as we do. So please join me in welcoming Iris Bohnet.
Thank you for this very kind and warm introduction, Cheryl. It's certainly been a great pleasure to spend the week here in Melbourne, and particularly with VicHealth. And thank you to Nithya Solomon as well for hosting me here, and for Leonora for her vision in all the work that Wen is doing. And I was delighted when you reached out to me, and I'm very, very happy to be here. So I'm happy to hear that you had a great 2 days on the workshop, that you have spent time with Shelley, that you have had, I'm sure, some sad moments learning about all the evidence. But, you know, in many ways, that's a very good thing, that the evidence is catching up with much of what has been going on in the last 20, 30 years. So I'm quite delighted that we are now employing the same kind of rigor to questions of gender equality that we might have employed to questions of, you know, labor markets or equality more generally, or efficiency gains, whatever it might be. So I think that's all over a good thing, even though I think in particular in our profession, we realize that now is a particularly important moment for us to take some action and move the needle to increase gender diversity in the economics profession and make this a more inclusive environment where men and women can thrive. So today I want to take a bit of a bigger perspective and talk about a little bit about my book, but then also a bit about what happened since my book was published in 2016, but some new research about where I see us going maybe as a profession, but also where I see some of the needs being in particularly accurate. So let me start with someone who many of you who have read the book will know. This is Heidi Roizen, but I'm just quickly having her up here to, in a couple of minutes, kind of bring us all kind of together on what unconscious bias is, and maybe also suggest to you that this could be a tool that you can use in your own classrooms. Because what we now do is we use this case study about Heidi Roizen, who is a venture capitalist in Silicon Valley, to teach our students about the power of unconscious bias in a matter of minutes, really. Half of our students get the case study with the protagonist being called Heidi. The other half is the protagonist being called Howard. And then they prepare for class. And they don't just prepare as they usually do, but they also fill out a questionnaire on how well Heidi and Howard did, and whether or not you would want to hire Heidi or Howard, or want to work with Heidi or Howard. And what we find time and again is that people, and I specifically say people, women and men, agree that Heidi and Howard did a great job, but we don't like Heidi. We wouldn't want to hire her or work with her because she defies our stereotypes of what a good woman does. Heidi is just a bit too assertive, just to be a bit too strategic, just a bit too successful. And she defies our stereotypes of what a typical venture capitalist looks like. So that's, you know, in a in a short couple of seconds, one way to think about unconscious bias. Now, of course, unconscious bias is everywhere. I recently looked for an icon on Expert, and I actually, knowing that Shelley talked to you already, I'm going to spare you the icons on economists. But anyway, so I looked for an icon on Expert. I also did the economists, but I looked for an icon on experts. On this webpage, there are 224 icons for experts. Exactly 6 are women's icons. It's worse in econ. Okay, so Cheryl just mentioned to you that we are pursuing some work right here in Victoria on trying to understand gender gaps in sports reporting. And the report will come out shortly, but I think I'm not surprising you by telling you that we find quite a bit of gender bias in reporting. Here's just one summary of what you will see very soon, in that for the woman, it takes a world record and a gold medal is not enough for her to be on the front page. So I think that's what we're up against, the shifting standards for men and women, whether this is in sports reporting or in the economic profession or any organization, really. In the book, you also have this depiction of the problem, which is a bit of a shortcut, I totally agree, but helps many people who haven't ever experienced unconscious bias understand what it means. What I'd love for you to do is to compare squares A and B for me. And I presume that even those of you who have read my book and have seen this before, you see square B as being lighter than square A. I'm now going to cover the surroundings, and I presume that about now you realize that in fact they have the same color. Now, why is that? This is, of course, a time when we can learn from psychologists who have told us for a long time that people tend to think and perceive in categories. So this is part of categorical thinking, where we put things, but also people, into categories. And you have a checkerboard here, and you know that a light box has to be next to a dark box, and that's just the rule of the game here. Literally, your minds are incapable of doing justice to square B, and only by my covering the surroundings, I'm liberating your minds to do justice to B and to see B for what it really is, just another dark square. So, of course, this is kind of a fun illustration, but the big question is whether this could even have any real-world relevance. And as you probably know, one of the most famous examples of covering, so to speak, the surroundings or blinding ourselves to demographic characteristics of people has been conducted and studied by Claudia Goldin and Cecilia Rouse, namely the screens that symphony orchestras in the United States introduced to help them listen to the music rather than seeing the people who are playing it. The screen, as you know from that paper, it's a 2000 AER paper. The screen has helped increase the fraction of women on our major orchestras in the US from about 5% in the 70s to now almost 40%. About half of that variance was due specifically to the introduction of the curtain. So you might think, well, the curtain is kind of makes sense, is intuitive for orchestras, but would it work in any other profession? Now, it turns out that an increasing number of organizations, private sector, public sector, are very much experimenting blind evaluation procedures, and maybe some of you, in fact, are conducting some randomized controlled trials with them. It's a very exciting field. The evidence is a bit mixed, and because I presume we're kind of in a room of economists, let me, in fact, unpack this just for a little moment. So some studies, like the Golden Rouse study, show that blind evaluations increase diversity. But we have two studies, one coming out of France and one, still a working paper, coming out of the Australian government, kind of showing some backlash. So let me unpack this a bit because it will be immediately intuitive to you why we find the differences in evidence. Both the Canberra evidence and the French evidence suffer from selection bias. In both cases, departments or companies could self-select to participate in this trial. And I know the French data even better. So what happened in France was that companies which were particularly progressive, caring about diversity already, self-selected to be part of this trial and then blinded themselves to demographic characteristics which did not allow them to do affirmative action. So in the end, they in fact ended up, and it wasn't so much gender in France, but they ended up with fewer non-French people being employed. For them, the big deal was immigrants versus French natives. So clearly, selection is an issue, and you're learning this in your studies. You're surely teaching it in your classrooms. So selection can lead to very different outcomes. So we just have to be, as always, quite careful about the underlying evidence that leads us to make certain inferences. So kind of all of that led me to write the book that Leonora kindly mentioned, feeling that the time was right for somebody to bring this all together and help move the needle on many different topics in HR departments, in governments, in society, in schools. And I felt particularly passionate because, in contrast to many other places, rigor, to my surprise, really had not entered HR departments to the degree that rigor had entered finance departments or even marketing departments. I mean, those of you in marketing will know that we have run experiments for a very long time. We have been testing whether the pink shampoo sells more bottles than the blue shampoo in a pretty rigorous manner for quite some time. We haven't done that in HR. And so that's a bit of a mission of mine to say that, you know, isn't people the most important resource, the scarcest resource really that we have, and shouldn't we be using the scrutiny that we use in other places, also in our people evaluations, in our hiring, etc. Okay, so that's kind of the journey I'd like to take you on, talking a bit about how we can use behavioral economics to move the needle on some more formal procedures, but then also a bit about kind of the informal stuff that now is increasingly also important in the economics profession. Okay, so the theme for today is this gap between intentions and actions, that well-meaning people, right, everyone in this room, doesn't always do what's right or what they intend to do. So let me give you another example. This is not research, but I think a story that might trigger some of your thinking of how we can, in fact, take some of these insights to all kinds of different simple places, including to the design of forms. So pretty much a year ago, I was in Stockholm meeting with the Nobel committees. And I was asked to come to Stockholm because the Nobel committees had realized that 97% of Nobel Prizes had gone to men, of Nobel Prizes in the sciences had gone to men. In economics, of course, you know that the only female recipient so far has been Elinor Ostrom, who was not an economist. She was a political scientist who wanted to study economics, but at the time was told that economics was not for women. This is a story that I know because she told me. I spent a month in Bloomington with her now many years ago, but it's also a story that you can read on the Nobel Prize Committee's website. So that was the reason for me to be there. And as you might imagine, the Nobel Prize selection process is super secretive. So I can't say I know even half of how it works. But some things are now transparent, and here's one of the things that was introduced after I had met with the Nobel committees. To give you a bit of background, this was motivated by research in psychology a number of years ago, where psychologists were interested in something completely different in snack choices. And they asked the question of whether people make different snack choices depending on whether you decide as a bundle or whether you decide sequentially. So literally what they did, they went into high school, asked half of the high school students to choose a snack for the next 30 days of the month. So you all would choose 30 snacks today, and you have hundreds of snacks available, so no scarcity of snacks. This treatment condition here was asked to choose a snack every day of the month. Every morning of the month, you choose a snack for today. So already those of you kind of doing research design can see like 100 differences between what you're doing and what you're doing, including intertemporal preferences that, of course, when I choose a snack for in an hour now, I'm much more likely to go for the chocolate bar than when I choose a snack for 30 days from now. So I'm not saying it was the perfect design, but it did show something that motivated me to apply this to people. Namely, what they found was that the group that chose 30 snacks today was much more likely to go for variety, and the group that chose snacks sequentially went for the same snack, much more likely to go for the same snack every day. So we applied this to people decisions, ran some real experiments, and found the same pattern, that when we make bundle decisions, diversity is much more likely to emerge. And so I applied this, in fact, in our hiring procedures at Harvard, which I'll talk about in a moment, but also was one of my recommendations for the Nobel Committee. Because every year I'm getting a form that looks like this, is actually a copy from my form. Every year I'm getting a form where I am asked to nominate somebody for the Nobel Prize in economics. And that form asks me to make exactly one recommendation. And so what I told the committees was, why don't you ask people like me, your nominators, to make more than one recommendation, because I would predict that diversity would be more likely to emerge. Now, I have no idea whether it worked. We have, of course, seen many more women recipients than ever before, but this is, of course, not research. We have 1 year of data, and I have, of course, no access to the kinds of recommendations that people make. I can tell you, though, that given that I'm academic dean at Harvard and that I am responsible for faculty hiring and promotions, the fact that we're now bundling different hiring decisions in one faculty meeting does lead to quite a different conversation. Again, this is not research just based on research. But we used to hire, microeconomists in February. That's when our market is. We used to do this at a different time for sociologists, psychologists, historians. And every time we ended up with this one person, 3 finalists, and the committee saying, we looked everywhere, but there are just no non-American, non-white, non-male people in the world. So, we're back with who we always had. Now we make 3 decisions at the same point. We have 9 finalists. And, it's just harder to say, all 9 finalists look like the people we've always had. But in any case, this is just story application. This is not the fundamental research. But anyway, so that's how you can use those insights, promoting change, in fact, quite quickly. My goal for us, and that's, of course, a big goal. I'm not saying we'll be achieving it tomorrow, but that would be kind of my dream, is to make it easier for all of us to get this right. So many of you probably have been in a hotel room at one point where the room key card did not just serve the purpose of opening and closing doors, but also of turning lights on and off. It's a little bit of design, a little bit of technology makes it easier, and that's, of course, no surprise for economists, makes it easier that people, in fact, comply. This is very, very different from many of the things that we, and now the we as kind of we collectively, have been doing in the last 50 or 60 years in the US, about since the civil rights movement in the 60s, where a lot of money and attention in particular has been devoted to the first agenda item there, diversity training. Now, I have to tell you that I am updating what I wrote in my book a bit. When I wrote the book, the truth was that I could not find one single study showing that diversity training works. That led me to kind of say, who knows, maybe somebody has invented something amazing that wasn't tested, but certainly we don't have evidence to show that this works. In the meantime, I came across a working paper, which is now forthcoming in the Quarterly Journal of Economics by somebody who we then hired, Michela Carlana. She is an assistant professor at the Kennedy School from Bohnet University in Italy. And her job market paper evaluated the impact of making teachers aware of their unconscious biases. And so let me quickly summarize what she found. So first of all, before I summarize what she found, let me give you the design. The design is actually pretty straightforward. What she was interested in was teachers grading behaviors. And she was extremely fortunate to have access to an enormous amount of data on grades. And she found that there are gaps, both in terms of gender, but also in terms of Italians versus immigrants in kind of teachers grading behaviors. She also has some control variables where she can control for performance, etc. So I'm not going to go into the detail here. But it is a kind of a nice, clean design. And then she had every teacher who was grading a final exam in high school, so the big final exam in Italian high schools, take an IIT test, where she made them aware of their implicit biases. And then the experimental design is very simple. She either informed the teachers before they graded about the outcome of their IIT, or she informed the teachers after they had graded about the outcome of their IIT. It's very simple. And then the question is, knowing that you are a racist or knowing that you're sexist, is that going to affect how you grade? And miraculously, that's exactly what she found. So she found that on average, teachers who were informed of their IIT score had smaller gender gaps in their grades and had also smaller gaps between immigrants and Italians. The story, though, is even a bit more complicated, so I'm just giving you now the main effect. But she also found something interesting in distribution, because what she did is she asked all the teachers beforehand. She did a bit of a survey, the world values type questions, where she asked teachers about their gender attitudes. So, do you think men should be primary breadwinners? Do you believe in kind of gender gaps in pay is a problem? Things of that sort. So, world values type questions. And she also got a bit more information on their political affiliations, etc. And so she actually found heterogeneity in responses. The intervention worked particularly well for people who affiliated with kind of more social democratic parties and people who had already indicated that they cared about gender equality. It did not work for people who did not care about gender equality and or who affiliated with the most conservative party in Italy, which is the Lega Norte. So I think that's also important information for us, that these interventions might not work for everyone, right? Of course, we're interested as economists typically in main effects, but we also have to pay attention to this heterogeneity in responses. That for some people, being aware of these implicit biases might in fact lead to either no response or worse, to backlash. In any case, so I'm updating my beliefs in the sense that this is one of the first really good studies. I have heard right here in Australia a bit more emerging evidence on testing unconscious bias training at our conference earlier with VicHealth. So maybe there's more emerging, and I think that's all a good thing. So I would love for us to figure out how diversity training can be done better, how it can be done more effective, how it can have real behavioral impacts. But I think the lesson kind of is that what we know at this point is that it can have these very short-term impacts, as in Michaela's work. But we don't know yet, of course, and her work doesn't speak to this, whether it still impacts these teachers in a month from now or a year from now. But immediately, it's relevant. And that's not unimportant, because now I actually have a number of companies that I work with which have asked me whether they should do an unconscious bias awareness moment before important decisions, such as before promotion rounds. Many companies have these promotion committees where you meet and then you decide about who's being promoted this year. Maybe it would be good to have some sort of IIT awareness type of intervention to be tested. Just speculating here. But I'm only mentioning this to say something only having short-term impact is not always just bad. You just have to be true to the facts and then see what it could potentially be good for. Okay. The book goes into more detail about many of these other initiatives. The one thing I do want to say, though, that I'm very happy and proud of, and I'm also very happy and proud that Wen is doing this too, is that the CSWAP intervention, of course, is probably the only mentoring program that has been run as an RCT and therefore could be evaluated over time. And as you probably know, the impacts are very encouraging, that people who have been selected, randomly selected, picked out of a hat to participate in the CSWAP workshop, had more success afterwards. So clearly we need more of these randomized controlled trials, leadership training programs. We know very little. Huge problem. By the way, it's always a big question I'm getting asked, and then I have to give it back kind of to the organization saying, it's just a huge problem because you tend to the company, tend to select the people who get to go to the leadership training program, and that in itself means we can't evaluate its impact. Okay, so now I want to do two things. I want to talk a bit about talent management, kind of what the research says on talent management, and then I want to kind of open the discussion a bit and talk more broadly about schools and other places where we might want to apply some of these findings. So I'm going to go very quickly here. Many of you probably have heard me talk about this. This is the marketing department that knows exactly why men are not buying Diet Coke because rigorous research showed them that diet was not a male word. And many, not just I, have applied this now to de-biasing language in job advertisements. And, you know, truth be told, that might have been one of the most successful low-hanging fruits that we could have harvested. I haven't yet found an organization which, you know, for whom this didn't resonate. As in, why would you use stupid language in your job ads if you could use more inclusive language and benefit from 100% of the talent pool? That's a school, that's a real excerpt from a school who wrote to me, could I help them attract more male teachers? Because in most primary schools, including in Australia, most teachers are women. And there's an excerpt there looking for a warm and caring teacher with exceptional pedagogical and interpersonal skills to work in a supportive, collaborative work environment. Turns out warm, caring, interpersonal, supportive, collaborative are gender-typed words. Doesn't mean that men cannot be warm and caring, but in our minds, they're sort of typically associated with women. And we now have big data analytics, which can help us predict by how much using these words will decrease the likelihood that men will apply. Quite a number of papers in this space. Andreas Leibrand, originally from Monash, now at Griffith University, has done really interesting work, if that interests you, not just on gendered language, but also, for example, do you mention that wages are negotiable? Do you talk about the competitiveness in the job? All RCTs finding that there are gender differences in responses. If you're looking for a field to work in, this is a relatively easy one because it's easier for organizations to give you their job advertisements to allow you to play with them. It's much easier than getting into the organization and trying to work on hiring schemes or promotion schemes, where I'm going to move next. I don't think it is the biggest impact that we could have, but it is certainly a place where we can do good work that allows us to do causal inferences. As I said, it gets much harder when you want to do RCTs at the hiring stage, although not impossible. But so we have some kind of insights at this point of what works and what doesn't work at this stage, although we need much more. So one thing, that's why I have this cheesy stock photo up here. One thing that we kind of do know is probably a bad idea is to have these panel interviews. And those of you who have applied for a job in econ will know that we still do those, where you are, worse still, in a hotel room. It was even worse when I applied 25 years ago. The beds were not made at the time. But now, at least, I think we're moving into suites where we're not actually sitting on beds. But in any case, so we're learning. We're still doing these panel interviews. And this is not rocket science to believe that groupthink is going to affect the assessments of these three people. Like, they hear each other. They build on each other's comments. They hear the responses of the candidates to interviewer one's answers. And questions, interviewer one's questions. And so it's really not practical and not sensical to do panel interviews. Much better to have one-on-ones. That's not actually more costly for the interviewers. It is more costly for the candidates, no question, but it will give us a sample of 3 assessments rather than a sample of just one. If this interests you in particular, I don't want to spend too much time on the specifics here. I've written a lot about this, also an HBR article, which kind of summarizes the whole evidence. We actually know quite a bit already on how to do this better. And if you pushed me and asked me, what is the best predictor to predict future performance, it is absolutely not the interview, whether structured or unstructured. Structured interviews are better than unstructured interviews, but it is a work sample test. It can not particularly surprising for an economist, I think, to imagine that if you want to hire a coder, you might ask that person to write some code. If you want to hire a research assistant, you might actually give that person a research project and see how the person does. I recently hired an executive assistant. I also gave every applicant a number of tasks that are relevant for me, for somebody to fulfill this job in a manner that is helpful to me. So I think this is a solvable problem. There's also a number of other guidelines that we have been trying to create, working with the UK Government Equalities Agency, the Behavioural Insights team, just bringing those insights kind of to the practice. But already when you go to this webpage here, you will see that we in fact struggled quite a bit. And I just thought I'd take a moment kind of thinking a bit about this. In that, the good news is we have much more evidence now. The bad news is that much of the evidence, or all of the evidence, by definition, maximizes internal validity, but not necessarily external validity, right? So it was actually really hard for us to say, well, you know, here are the 5 things you should be doing, because then we would have to say, you know, the first intervention has been tested in Switzerland and Australia and in the US, and it has been tested in these different sectors, but I don't know whether it's going to work in Guatemala. And so we struggled with that a bit, and if you're interested, you can see how we dealt with it. I mean, we tried to put nuances to, you know, how much evidence we have kind of in support of one particular strategy. Okay, another kind of good thing that has happened in the last 3 years is all this, and there are many more, where startups, including some Australian startups, have taken the insights from my book and turned them into technology. So that's, you know, another way, of course, to get scale, and also another way to collect more data. So if you're looking for a partner, don't always think that it needs to be a big company or government. It could also be a startup. In fact, many of my doctoral students now work with these startups. The barriers to entry are much easier. The startups are interested in learning what works and what doesn't work, and that often lends itself to RCTs. Okay. So the last thing I want to talk about in talent management is this question of promotions. And that's, of course, an important topic for econ as well, but also for the rest of the world. Yes, we need to do better at hiring, but in particular, we need to think more about career advancement. So let me give you kind of 3 thoughts on what we know works at this point, and then also talk about a specific study that we're currently running. So first of all, and this is also important for our own profession, is what you might want to call performance support bias. And let me give you the intuition of how I came about to think about this. So about 1.5 years ago, for some reason, I ended up working a bit more with law firms. And all the law firms I've ever worked with have gaps in promotions by gender, by race, and also by nationality. So these are all American headquartered law firms. There's American versus non-Americans, women versus men, people of color versus white people. So we do have a gap. And there's things that we did to the promotion process. So there's things that I think were wrong with the promotion process. But the committees I worked with kept telling me something that I really hadn't thought about enough before. They kept saying, you know, some people just have a thin file. And so then I asked, yeah, what do you mean? What I learned was that some people were just not given a lot of opportunity to perform during their 8 years in that law firm. What we then found by really looking at the data very carefully is that this performance support bias starts in year 1, when you join a firm as a first-year associate, and the partners already in the firm choose people they want to work with. And what we could show is that the partners not just replicate themselves in terms of demographic characteristics, but also chose people who have graduated from the same law school that they did. So clearly a lot of in-group bias going on. And that then created a thin file. And some people had never been included in cool deals. We could also show that women and people of color, non-Americans, were given less feedback, counting the words, less useful feedback, just weren't taken care of the same way as their American white male counterparts. So what this law firm is doing now, this particular big law firm, is they now have work allocation centralized. Central partner who has a little office, and they're watching, tracking, measuring over time who is given which opportunity, who is allocated to which team. I think this is important for econ as well, that we have to think hard about the opportunities that we give our junior faculty members as they enter our profession. You know, who has to teach the hard course in econometrics that for the course that we know has not had good teaching evaluations for the last 10 years. You know, who has to teach the small classes or gets to teach the small classes? Who gets to teach the large classes? Who gets to teach the classes which are closer to their expertise? Who has to teach, you know, more qualitative classes? I know most of you are economists, but I have to tell you, one of the gaps that we found at the Kennedy School was actually between quantitative and qualitative classes. For us, grading takes a fraction of the time as compared to our colleagues who teach qualitative classes and have to read 30-page papers. Right? For us, it's really, we can check the box and measure, you know, and just count whether the answers are correct, but not so much for them. So in fact, we had to give them a grading bonus. But so bias is everywhere. It's inadvertent, you know, unconscious, but we have to start with this support. Okay. Secondly, and this is a bit less relevant for econ per se, but let me in fact give you a study that we're currently running focusing on this very problem. So this is a large multinational, 150,000 employees headquartered in the UK, and they were concerned about not being able to move more on gender diversity in their company. So this was all about gender. And normally what we do when we work with a company, we first do a diagnostic of, so by the way, I don't work with a company if I don't have access to data. So that's kind of the first thing. And that's, by the way, a good thing to ask for. If they don't want to share data with you, then you know that there's probably not much research for you to be done there. So in any case, this is this company. They have these career ladder here. And so the first thing we do is super simple, just a diagnostic of where do we raw data, where do we see gender gaps? Is it in hiring? Is it in promotions? Is it in exit? Then we do something a bit more fancy, try to control for everything else that we can control for, every information that we have. And in most of these organizations, including in this one, we find that the big action, not the exclusive action, but the big action is on promotions. So then we honed in on promotions and tried to unpack what was going on in the gender gap in promotions. And we also had information on people's performance ratings. So what I'm now going to show you is the relationship between performance ratings and likelihood of promotion by gender. So in blue, you have the likelihood that men are promoted. In red, you'll have the likelihood that women are promoted. And on the x-axis here, you have the 5 promotion ratings that people could have had. So from 1 to 5. Okay, so if you're a 1 or a 2, you are not promoted. You shouldn't be promoted. You could potentially even be fired. So that's not a great place to be. So likelihood is very, very small. And generally, by the way, I mean, few people are promoted, right? So don't think, I'm not going to show you kind of huge numbers here. Few people are promoted to start with. So if you're a 3, there's not much going on there. You know, not many people are promoted, about the same, maybe slightly more women, but about the same. And then we get to 4 and 5, and we found this curious thing. So the fact that you do not see a red bar here is not a mistake in my slides, but we in fact found that promotion ratings were not correlated with promotions. Oh, excuse me, performance ratings were not correlated with promotions for women. So these are the most highly rated people, right, in the company, the 4s and 5s. And a high rating increases the likelihood of promotions for men, but not for women. So that for the company was like, oh my God. So that was a very interesting eye-opener for them. And it turns out that they promote not based on performance, although they thought that they were promoting based on performance, but based on potential. Right? So yeah, we have these great men and women, but she's just not ready to take on a leadership position. You know, she did well in her previous assignment, and so did he, but I can see it in his very eyes that he's made to be a leader. Potential is the home of bias. Many companies evaluate people on past performance, future potential. You can imagine past performance more easily, and that's not objective, but more easily measurable, quantifiable, potential, very hard to predict. That's where we look at what our organization looks like, and we're like, yeah, you know, does he look like the former CEO? No, that might be great. So anyway, so here's what we're doing with the company now. We created scorecards for managers And we created a little index, which we call the gender promotion ratio, where we tell managers how many men and women they have promoted in the past year, the past 5 years, excuse me, compared to the available pool of men and women. Right? If you're equally likely to promote men and women compared to the pool, your gender promotion ratio is 1. If you promote more women than men, it's higher than 1. If you promote more men than women, it's below 1. I can tell you already, so this is still going on, but looks, so we're quite enthusiastic already, because we in fact thought this is going to be the lower baseline for us, and then we'll include some norm nudges, which I'll talk about more in a moment, but many of you will be familiar with these norm nudges where you compare your own performance with what other people have been doing. And so we thought just giving them information is going to be a baseline, and then we'll add more information, kind of making this competitive, showing me what other people are doing. Just giving managers information on their past already has a huge impact. Suggesting that much of this happens unconsciously, unintentionally, and sometimes kind of showing you the numbers can in fact work. Okay. So now let me, as I said, broaden our applications a little bit and go beyond the kind of work. My first example is one of my very favorite studies run by Katie Baldiga-Kaufman. She was a doctoral student of mine, is now an assistant professor at the Harvard Business School. And her concern were multiple choice tests. You probably also have them. They play a huge part in the US. They play a particularly huge part for the most important test that American students ever have to take, the SAT. And her concern was that checking a box, if you don't know the answer, is a bit like raising your hand in class when you're not really sure about the answer. Right? And there's lots of evidence, of course, suggesting that women are slightly less overconfident, slightly more risk averse on average, and in fact are slightly less likely to raise their hands in class. And so she was nervous that maybe women wouldn't check a box, but instead skip the question. And that's exactly what you can do in this test. So you either know the answer, you check a box, you don't know the answer, you guess, or you skip the question, you leave everything blank. And so what she did is she brought people to the lab, to the Harvard Decision Science Laboratory, had them take the SAT as it is usually conducted, and then, given that this was an experiment, repeated the SAT but forced everyone to answer every question. And so therefore, she knew what people would have known had they answered. And she finds that it cost women 7 percentage points on the SAT, holding ability constant, just the fact that they're more likely to skip rather than to guess. And that's equally able, equally qualified, equally knowledgeable men and women. But just because the test is biased against people less willing to take risk or less self-confident, we get the 7 percentage points difference. It's a huge difference. That is the difference between getting into an elite college versus a non-elite college. So in any case, then we lucked out that in 2012, Dave Coleman was appointed as the chair of the College Board. The College Board designs these tests. And he was very concerned about all kinds of biases in the test, not just gender biases, racial biases, non-native speaker biases, immigrants, etc. They introduced 10 new things, and I'm happy to say one of them is also to gender de-bias the test. So in 2016, the new test was rolled out, and it had this one feature which is directly related to this research. In that, the College Board decided, and you will be interesting to hear this in fact, to take away penalties from wrong answers completely, right? So before the test, you got 1 point for right answers, a quarter point deduction from wrong answers, 5 possible answers, a little bit of math tells you as soon as you can exclude one possible answer, it's a dominant strategy to guess. But it's a little risky, right? So this is assuming risk neutrality. If we have gender differences in willingness to take risk, of course, we still get this distribution. So when they took the penalty away, basically they argued, we just don't want this to be about risk. This is not a test that was designed to measure risk. This was a test designed to measure people's knowledge. Of course, critiques were loud, kind of saying, oh my God, you are inviting wild guessing. At which point, the answer was, we have been inviting guessing by 50% of the population for 100 years. Yes, it's now about time to level the playing field. So you can see why this is, I like this a lot. I mean, of course, the paper was published greatly in great journals. I don't even remember right now whether it was Management Science or the AR, but it's a clean design, nice paper, great career for her, but also has this very direct policy relevance and can literally change lives and improve lives, particularly for girls. Okay, so what more can we do in this broader kind of spectrum beyond just organizations? So I thought I'm going to give you an example from politics. The best evidence is often a question that I'm asked. The best evidence on quotas that we have actually comes out of India. This is research by Esther Duflo, Rohini Pandey, and others, kind of looking at the change in India's constitution in 1993, where India amended the constitution by requesting villages to have a third of village leaders being female. In addition, a third of parliaments, councils, village councils also had to be women. And some of you are probably familiar with this work, in particular if you're in development economics. By now, we have about 20 papers who have been written about this particular experiment, which was super interesting from a research point of view, because the third of villages literally was picked out of a hat, so randomly drawn. And so it's almost a natural experiment. Maybe just two important findings, but there are many more in terms of role models. So in villages which have been exposed to at least 2 female leaders in those now 25 years, mindsets have started to change. So this is a paper published in Science very recently, kind of showing that village leaders now are much more likely to associate, in fact, there's no gender gap anymore in that associate women with leaderships. And for parents, a core career aspirations for their daughters is, in fact, to become politicians. So that's a beautiful story. It's also an interesting story, not just a story, it's actual evidence. It's also interesting in the sense that one didn't cut it. Right? So I have no idea how generalizable this is, but it is kind of interesting that having been exposed to one female leader wasn't able to move the needle enough. But with villages which have been exposed to at least 2, these mindsets have started to change. Another paper that I recommend to you in case you're interested in that particular question, of course, an important question in this country and in every country, looks at domestic violence and in particular reporting of domestic violence. Of course, we know huge theoretical problems in reporting bias and underlying prevalence, so they could not resolve that either. But they did find that in villages with female leaders, the reporting went up dramatically. Okay, I thought that given what Leonora kind of shared with us in the beginning, and much of the work also that Wen is doing with bringing economists to classrooms, so girls can see themselves reflected as economists as well, I just do the walk of shame here for a moment and tell you about Harvard. So it's just 12 years ago that at the Kennedy School, we realized that of all the portraits of leaders on our walls, exactly 0 were of female leaders. 50% of our students are women, and I can attest that that wasn't a conscious decision to tell our women that they're not made to be leaders, but it took a professor here, a colleague of mine, Jenny Mansbridge, to actually see this. I've been at Harvard for 20 years. I did not notice. So that's my walk of shame. We now have many more portraits. We commissioned many more portraits. This is Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, a graduate of the school, the former president of Liberia. So we're changing the face of the Kennedy School. And we know from experiments in psychology that seeing truly is believing. There's actually, I didn't know that before I wrote the book, there's actually a flourishing piece of research in psychology trying to understand how you can activate certain identities of people. Right? Most of us, and all of us, are made of 1 million different identities. I'm Swiss, I'm a mother, I live in the US, I'm an economist, I'm a synchronized swimmer, lots of things that make up my identity. And so the question for psychologists was, which part of my identity is prevalent in a given moment, and how are environmental cues activating certain parts of my identity? Sometimes also called stereotype threat, in the negative, that images on the wall might remind me of some parts of my identity that will undermine my performance here on stage. So just, if that interests you, there's good research kind of showing what happens when you show some of these leaders. I should have Julia Gillard up here, who I think is an amazing role model in Australia, but the research was literally done with Angela Merkel and the Clintons, kind of showing that women give stronger, longer, more powerful, more positively evaluated speeches when they saw one of these images just beforehand. I know for economists that's like hard to believe, but it is quite serious research. Okay, so let me conclude by now moving to what I consider maybe the tip of the iceberg, or maybe it's actually wrong. Maybe it's not the tip of the iceberg. Maybe we have worked on the tip of the iceberg and haven't really uncovered the rest of the iceberg underwater. I think that's probably more likely how we should think about this. Because much of the action, I think, today, and of course a challenge for us economists, because we need data to make any inferences, but is a bit in the informal space. And so let me talk a bit about kind of how we might want to think about this. So first of all, this in fact is an Australian board image, not one from today. But in any case, it's probably not how we would like our boards to be. There is good evidence, I think. So I'm starting with the high evidence place. There's good evidence to suggest that numbers do matter. That, and particularly I'm thinking of the research on collective intelligence coming out of MIT and Carnegie Mellon, doing a very nice job showing how we could measure the intelligence of groups and showing that that's actually correlated with the gender diversity on those groups. I was happy to see that as I was traveling to Australia, just in the last 2 years, gender diversity on your corporate boards has dramatically increased by more than 10 percentage points. And that was a combination, this is close to econ again, but was a combination of goals, but also of investor and shareholder pressure. So there were real incentives for these boards to move, and they moved. Now, let me just put a careful note in here on something that I think has been oversold quite a bit. So I've just mentioned collective intelligence, and I think there's very good causal inferences that we can draw from that research. However, I do think generally the business case has been oversold. I think it has been oversold based on that research, sometimes not even correlational research, but if anyone tells you, I know that gender diversity on corporate boards leads to better company performance, you will have to tell them that there's no way they can draw that inference. There's no way to make a causal argument. Yes, some studies have found correlations, but there's no country in the world where these things have been randomly assigned. We haven't come across an instrument yet to test these types of interventions. We can't do other types of advanced econometric techniques, such as discontinuity analyses. So it really is kind of, I think, an open question to which degree A leads to B. But there are a number, I mean, this is one big data set. They do not claim causality, so there's no criticism here. But I thought I'd bring this up here because it has this interesting kind of change in 2007. So these are the 2,500 biggest countries. And in black, you have, in green, you have the relative performance of companies with one or more women as compared to companies with no women. And it appears as if gender diversity might have been particularly correlated with performance post-2008, which is something that, again, psychologists would have told us for a long time, that, of course, if you have a simple problem to solve, we all have to run in one direction, diversity might not be particularly productive. You might want to have homogeneous groups, the leader says A, and we're all running towards A. But as complexity increases, I'm just now reporting from psychology, diversity might actually be more beneficial. So I do think that whole question of the business case and when is diversity particularly helpful, when is it less helpful, is in fact a research question that needs much more study. Finally, on numbers, so numbers do matter, diversity, is kind of important, collective intelligence, etc. There's also research suggesting that it's not just numbers per se, but there's also something about critical mass. That this is not necessarily a linear function, that the more of X, the better, or the more of X until we have 50-50, the better. But it does appear as if you're the only one, you're much more likely to be taken for a token. And if you're two, it's still kind of a small group, and we're thinking there's collusion. It's always the two women on the board who talk to each other. And then it appears to be this magic 30% or 3-ish kind of people of a given group to help us move beyond the visible characteristics of kind of these individuals. So critical mass is another one that I think we have to think about. But now I'm going to go into the intangibles. It is numbers, and absolutely, but there's more to effective collaboration than just having the right people in the room. We do need, and including we economists, do also need to think about the norms of interaction. I sometimes kind of show this image here, asking the audience kind of a very simple question: where would you be more likely to drop a piece of paper, on the left beach or the right beach? And then, of course, we have to ask ourselves the question of what our departments, our classrooms, our boardrooms, our organizations, our departments look like. Do they look more like the right beach or more like the left beach? And therefore, do people feel entitled to interrupt, to discredit, to not give credit to people's comments, to drop sexist or racist jokes? I think that's really the task ahead of us, including for job talks or department seminars, in particular in economics. As you probably know, I don't know whether Shelley talked about this, but when you do surveys with econ students, one of the big factors deterring women from pursuing degrees in economics or pursuing an academic career is, in fact, a toxic atmosphere in our department seminars. Those of you who have been to other disciplines probably have noted that the econ way is not the only way, that there are other departments which communicate with each other very, very differently in our seminars. And I have to tell you, Harvard, of course, is the biggest culprit of all, maybe the second biggest. The worst seminars typically tend to happen in Chicago, and they know it. So I'm not blaming Chicago. They have that reputation, and you know it, that if you can talk for 10 seconds, that will already be victory, because normally you were interrupted after 5. So that's something for us to really think about, I think, as a profession. But let me give you a bit, kind of some ideas of what we're currently doing in terms of research. And that's very much emerging. I don't think anyone has cracked that nut. But if you talk to companies, that is the big ask. Help us with culture. We're getting it. We're getting it. This is beyond process. It is kind of the culture that we have in our organizations, in our meetings, in our performance appraisals, in our feedback rounds, etc. But a few things we're trying out. So one, as I just mentioned, feedback, an experiment that Ariella Crystal, a doctoral student right now, is running, is looking at replacing, this will sound super simple, but it looks like it's working. So, replacing feedback, the word feedback, with the word advice. We're finding in course evaluations that if you ask students to give their professors advice as compared to feedback, the gender gaps are disappearing. So like everyone else, we find gender gaps in course evaluations. Probably Shelley talked about that. This seems like a super simple intervention. Think of it, right? This goes back to psychology. If you ask me to give you feedback, this is also a bit about me, as in kind of showing how cool and smart I am. I'm going to give you some feedback on, really telling you who you are. But if you ask me to give you advice, you activate my identity as a mentor, sponsor, somebody who's actually maybe telling you the same thing, as in, you should speak up less or you should speak up more, whatever it might be. But if I give you advice, I can say, that might be really good for you because it's just you've been too dominant, and I can see how others are no longer listening when you're speaking, and I think you really have to try to build on other comments, etc. on that. So it's a very different type of framework. Anyway, so that's Ariela's thesis. So these are the kind of things we're trying. With another company, we're trying the following. So most companies I work with who want to do culture, I always focus on meetings because at least that's a bit more tangible. And the first thing we do is we identify people's experiences. So the microaggressions that people experience, experience of exclusions, etc. So we write them down. Then we turn the negative experiences into desired behaviors. What would I like to experience? So that's the second step. And then thirdly, and that's where the behavioral econ kicks in, then it is clear to us that these intentions will not turn into actions unless we think very hard about what happens tomorrow when you're in your next meeting. So one company, this is not research, but it's a good story. One company introduced little red flags on their conference tables. You come in, you pick up a red flag, you raise the red flag whenever transgression occurs. Now I get it, even for economists, it's a heavy-handed intervention. So I observed one of the meetings, 3 things happened. Of course, the barriers to entry were lowered, red flags were up a lot, people raised red flags on themselves. Secondly, though, it decriminalized transgressions because everyone had the red flags up a lot. And thirdly, brought humor to the meeting. So we're employing these insights now for a real RCT with a big company where we have created an app that measures people's experiences in the meetings. It's super simple. I was clear this is financial sector, so nobody has time. It had to be super simple, so it's more like the traffic light that some airports now have. You know, how was your experience? Green, yellow, red. It's a bit more like that. So how effective, how inclusive, and how happy were you in the meeting? That's all we're measuring. And then beforehand, our treatment variables are in people's calendar entries when they are invited to the meeting, but also just before the meeting, we send them a reminder of a desired behavior. So we're trying to kind of just make this front of mind of who we want to be as a community. And of course, the hope is, and that's the big question for lots of the nudge research, the hope is that eventually we will internalize those norms of behaviors. But the final verdict on that, of course, is still out. Okay. Having said this, you know, we have been norm entrepreneurs for a long time, and that's really a bit of a call for action here, which is a bit beyond my being an economist. And I'm super, you know, I was super interested in working with VicHealth because VicHealth, together with the Cancer Council, has in fact achieved this before. Most of you probably weren't quite born yet then, but some of you might remember the Quit campaign, which helped people quit smoking in Victoria, which was super successful. And so we have done this. We have changed norms. We have moved from the bad equilibrium, from the dirty beach, to the good equilibrium, to the clean beach before. We've done it on helmets, on seat belts, on smoking, also on littering. So that's a bit my bigger mission in life. You know, could we do something like this for gender equality, where we and you know, clearly we are on this journey already, where we all become norm entrepreneurs in our respective organizations to help us move from this bad equilibrium to the good equilibrium where we have truly equal opportunity for all. There's another NGO which is trying to kind of live this from a student of mine. So she's trying to redecorate the walls, what we wear, kind of, you know, lots of different types of nudges, screensavers to think about kind of inclusion. Okay, so I want to end by giving you kind of, you know, 2 kind of nuggets of kind of what does this look like kind of more concretely in terms of norm entrepreneurship. This is based on the work by Cass Sunstein, another famous behavioral scientist, law professor, and of course the co-author with Dick Saylor of Nudge. This might be an image that you've seen before. When Cass worked for the US government, he was surprised by the bad communication really on anything that the government is trying to achieve. And see, he was a bit on a mission to do many things, but here's one little thing that they, in fact, implemented. So this is the food pyramid that was used in the United States for about 60 years to inform Americans about healthy eating. And here's a deep insight that Cass brought to the table. People do not eat off pyramids. So that's the new depiction. That's what I'm telling you. Sometimes it's so super simple, but you know, it's like 60 years, nobody noticed. Now we have this, and you know, it's much more intuitive to understand the relative share of proteins versus vegetables, for example. My personal beef is the dairy. So I'm a big yogurt lover, and I think they're lying there, of course. Okay, so one more. This is my own work, where we supported the UK government a bit in its effort to increase gender diversity on corporate boards. In 2011, the UK introduced goals to have 25% women on the FTSE 100 companies by 2015. And they started out with 12%. And in 2013, I got a call from the office of Vince Cable, the Secretary of Business at the time, kind of a bit crying for help a bit, saying that they had made progress. They were at 17%. This is what you're seeing here, 17 out of 100, 17% women, but they were stalling and weren't moving anymore. Could behavioral science help? And so we did a number of things, but this was one of the small things that we did, which I thought I'm going to show you just because kind of very close, I think, to behavioral economists' heart. So when I saw, this is the cover of their brochure that they had produced in 2013, reporting the evidence, guidelines, lots of different things, but this was the cover. And when I saw the cover, I was concerned that we're falling into the descriptive, prescriptive norm trap, right? That we're now describing the fraction of women on boards, and that this low fraction of women can turn into prescriptive norms in our minds. Much research kind of on norms, probably one of the most successful intervention in behavioral science and health and lots of different places, taxes so far. So I thought we should depict this differently. And so we created a different cover. So we're still talking about the same thing. We're still talking about the 100 companies, the FTSE 100 companies. Now you have the, you know, my little pairs here are companies each, the houses. And at the time, already 94% of the companies were gender diverse. And so what I was trying to signal here is that the thing to do, if you wanted to be a member of the club, you needed to be diverse. And, you know, in the end, kind of we succeeded with that. Okay, so the last two things I want to do is just point you to this public webpage. We are trying to be a bit of a repository of research on how to close gender gaps by summarizing research that allows us to make causal inferences, typically field experiments, sometimes lab experiments, sometimes you know, other diff and diff or other econometric techniques which allow us to do causality, the Gender Action Portal. So if you're interested in any of the research that I talked about today, probably all but the very newest ones have already been summarized. What we do is and if you, by the way, if you have something, send it to us. We're very interested in summarizing people's work, and then we send it back to the authors for final sign-off before it goes up. So this is not just us kind of making something up, but every paper has been signed, every summary has been signed off by the original authors. So just to make sure that people have access to this kind of information as practitioners. And then also to kind of maybe bridge this gap between intention and actions, we created a short film.
Let's face it, you're biased, but don't get defensive. We're built to be biased. Does your brain think these squares are different shades of gray? Think again. Your brain took this shadow into account and made assumptions that this square was darker, based on the checkerboard pattern. This natural tendency gives us shortcuts to make sense of our world. The trouble is, these shortcuts, when applied to people, can result in bias. So, how do we avoid unconscious bias to build a better society? Behavioral design offers a new solution to collapse gender inequality in our lifetime. What if we could make it easier for our biased minds to get things right by changing our organizations? For example, in the 1970s, major U.S. orchestras made an ingenious discovery. Adding a simple curtain to the audition process allowed them to listen to the music rather than judge musicians based on their looks.
Not only did they acquire better talent, but the fraction of female musicians grew by more than 30 percentage points. Simple solutions like this can also de-bias our workplace. Simply removing their names on resumes gets a lot of the bias out of the way and allows access to the full talent pool of candidates. And here's some low-hanging fruit. Research has shown comparing candidates to each other, rather than the imaginary stereotypical applicant, calibrates our minds to the best, rather than those who we think look the part. Behavioural designs like these have doubled the fraction of women on the boards of the UK's largest companies in a very short amount of time. Seeing women in leadership, whether in business or politics, changes what people think is possible for their daughters and themselves. In 1993, India mandated 1/3 of seats be reserved for women to serve as elected leaders at the local level. This not only offered new insights into public policy, but also encouraged women to speak up in community meetings. And seeing women work made it more likely for girls in the community to stay in school, marry later, and delay having their first child. Kind of gives weight to the phrase, seeing is believing. Many organizations, including Harvard, have taken this to heart by hanging up more portraits of female role models. Here's what you can do today. Try changing who we look up to on our walls. So, yes, it's time to face it. We're biased, but we can design around it. We have the research and tools to cheaply and quickly redesign how we work, learn, and live. It's not only the right thing, it's the smart thing to do. And now it's up to you.
On that note, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Bohnet, for such a jam-packed wealth of information and practical strategies there. I think we have time maybe for one select question. I'll let you choose.
Right, another trick of mine is to count to 5 before I call on anyone. So 1, no, please.
Wonderful.
There's research being done on how behavioural insights... I'm quite interested in whether there's research being done on how behavioural insights can be applied to getting men to take on more care roles and caring responsibilities. It's an area where I think the scope for government intervention is somewhat limited, so maybe these are the sort of interventions we need to look at.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you for this question. Super important question. If you're more interested in that whole bigger set of questions of kind of time, how time is allocated, between partners at home and work, look up Claudia Golden's work. That's her mission in life. She's currently writing a book on that. It was her presidential address when she was president of the American Economic Association. It was called The Last Chapter and was all about time. Totally kind of agreeing with you that the home, the household, and work are kind of the two sides of the same coin, and we have to open that black box of the household, and we haven't done enough yet. So absolutely, as long as women will do 2/3 or 3/4 of the child rearing and care at home, or that could also be elderly parents, we will not get to gender equality. So, do I have any hopeful news? Not extremely hopeful, a little hopeful. In that, I do think we can learn from the Scandinavian countries. This is more than a nudge, but having parental leave, and Sweden having learned that men are less likely to take parental leave, then creating incentives for men to take it, incentives for women to have the man take it, so the women also get more if the man take it. That is the most promising intervention to date, also showing good longer-term effects, that once men have been used to taking care of children, they're realizing that it's not so terrible, in fact, to spend some time with your child. Yes. But yes, this is still a big question for us, and yes, we should definitely do more on that. I fear, though, we need to hammer, not the nudge.
Hammer, not a nudge. I wish we could keep talking. I think you had so much there to share with us that we're sort of looking at the clock, unfortunately. So it's my great pleasure and honour to say thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Leona, for having me here.
We have a coffee cup, so when you're reading your book, it will match.
Oh, perfect. Oh, yes.
Yes.
I have a matching outfit too, just I'm not wearing it today.
I think we've seen that. And there's a copy of Womankind and a copy of our When newsletter and program.
Super. Thank you very much.
And Professor Bohnet's book we have copies for sale at the moment in the break, and I believe that on your way out you might be able to autograph a few for our participants here. Thank you very much again.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely brilliant.